Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our webinar on using ESSER funds to create sustainable investments in students. My name is Olka Joshi-Hansen. I'm Chief Program Officer of Grantmakers for Education. And on behalf of our team and our panelists, I want to thank you for joining us today for this really important conversation. The American Rescue Plan provided nearly $123 billion in relief to K-12 schools in 2021. And that was the largest ever one-time federal investment into that system. The 123 was the third round of aid from the Federal Elementary and Secondary Schools Emergency Relief Fund. Including ESSER 1 and ESSER 2, the program has made nearly $190 billion available to states. Now, the ESSER program is a major experiment in federal education funding because the dollars are intended to be incredibly flexible, with about 90% being spent at the discretion of local school districts. The only caveat is that 20% must be spent to address learning loss. And schools have until September of 2024 to obligate funds and early 2025 to draw them down. So we're now a bit more than 2 years into this investment, and it feels important for funders and others to be apprised of how funds are being used. We need to understand what there might be in terms of partnering with districts to strategically use the funds, and where funder dollars might best be used to supplement the federal dollars. Now, all this is happening against a political backdrop that became even clearer last week. And while education doesn't seem to have played as significant a role as it did in some state level elections, we still know that there's a very kind of divided country and narratives. So there are narratives that the slow rate of spending is evidence that districts aren't taking recovery seriously. There are people that say that data shows that the recovery isn't working and that these dollars are being spent in vain. So today we have a wonderful panel who's going to give us some updates on what's actually being done. And then we want to have a conversation, including with you, about how the conversations and work need to look moving forward in light of where districts, states, and the nation actually are. So we're so pleased to have with us today Dr. Andi Fourlis, who's the superintendent of Mesa Public Schools, Dr. Kent McGuire, who is with the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation, Jonathan Travers with Education Resource Strategies, and Holly Williams, who is also at Mesa Public Schools. For the format, each of our panelists are going to have a chance to present. I'd invite you to use the chat function to put questions as we go along. After they've done their presentation, we'll have a discussion with the panelists. And at that time, we would invite you to continue putting questions into the chat so we can make sure that you're getting what you need out of today's webinar. So without further ado, I want to pass this over to Jonathan Travers from ERS for our first presentation. Thank you so much, Jonathan.
Thanks, Olka. Nice to be with everybody this afternoon. So I want to provide a little bit of a sort of national landscape view of what we see as happening in school systems and districts with ESSER spending so far. I should say, as someone who's been focused on school and system resource use, resource allocation, budgeting for 20 years or so, the little period that we're in is genuinely unprecedented in terms of the opportunity it provides, in terms of sort of what's at stake, in terms of students meeting students' needs, and in terms of just changing our systems. So it's a really important time to be doing this work, and I'm grateful to Grantmakers for Education for being able to sort of sponsor this kind of a conversation. So I want to say just, you can see the background on ERS and some of the places that we've worked across the country. A lot of the perspective that I'm drawing from in sharing sort of national landscape today comes from a networked improvement community that we launched almost 2 years ago now, of which Mesa is a part, of ESSER leads, ESSER strategy leads, from 18 large, mostly urban, large districts all across the country, who came together. Sort of the idea was, can we use ESSER funds strategically to meet the needs of students and actually redesign how our system organizes to meet the needs of students? So that was sort of the cost of entry into the network. And so some of the lessons that we'll get today come out of the conversations that we've had roughly every month or so with Holly and colleagues from 17 other districts across the country. Want to first start with just sort of the basic facts of ESSER, because it actually means a few different things if we can advance in terms of just timeline and overall magnitude. Just to move the slide forward by one. When we say ESSER, we mean 3 tranches of funding. And really that first one was the CARES Act that came at the very beginning of the pandemic. That's now done. And really you can imagine just drawing a line above ESSER 1. And so the ESSER funds that we're talking about, or ARP, American Rescue Plan funds, this is ESSER 2 and ESSER 3. The bulk of the funding, you can see where we are right now in sort of middle or early-ish to middle 22-23. We're smack dab in the middle of the funding availability period that we have. So it's a really important moment to reflect on what we've learned about spending strategy so far, step back and make some adjustments for the second half. I'll talk a little bit in a second about our halftime reviews, but really important to be thinking about this moment of going back down the tunnel into the locker room to reflect on what we've learned so far, to come back out for the second half that much wiser and stronger. The other thing I'd say on just like, what's the magnitude of the funds that we're talking about? Yes, 189 billion is a lot of money. In terms of numbers that you can get your arms around, you know, for a large urban district, we're talking about a 10 to 15% increase over 3 consecutive years. As a budget director, you know, a 5% increase would have been a game changer. I wouldn't have known how to manage a 5% increase. So we're talking about 3 years of 10 to 15%. So an amazing opportunity, also an amazing challenge, just from how do you even conceive of organizing to spend that much money in ways that respond to student needs, that change underlying cost structures, that bring you back better and stronger on the back end, sustainable on the back end. Olka, you made reference, let's move to the next slide. Olka, you made reference a little bit to some national media coverage. Oh, sorry. One step before I hit that. We have laid out, go ahead to the next slide. We have laid out, coming out of these network improvement community conversations, a couple resources that I think might be helpful for you all as advisors and collaborators with system leaders, that help think about what does good investment or what is strategic investment of ESSER funds look like. First is a set of guiding principles, and I think my colleague Alex can chat in links to these 2 documents see if that works. But first is just a set of guiding principles that we put together at the beginning of the period. So how do we even think about what good investment looks like, and what are the things that system leaders ought to bear in mind as they plan out the spend? It was interesting going back and doing these halftime reviews over the last several months. These principles have held and actually provide an interesting basis for evaluating the spending that we've done so far, and a set of principles for now thinking about what the second half might look like. Second part, what we call the ERS 5 power strategies. This is our take that if you were to look at research on what's going to move the needle for kids and think about what are the categories, the kinds of investments that can change service delivery ongoing in ways that are sustainable, you'd probably come up with roughly these 5 categories. So we've laid out detail on each of these, what are the specifics within each that we think make sense, knowing that every district's context is different, but empowering adaptable instruction, time and attention, investments to improve the teaching job, relationships, social emotional supports, and investments in community and family partnerships. We think these are sort of 5 sort of archetypes of strategic ESSER spend that I think you'll hear from Dr. Fourlis and Williams in a minute. I think have bared out fairly well so far. Okay. How do you think about the shape of spending in ways over the time period that we've got, in ways that are sustainable, equitable, and strategic? This is a little bit of a 3 bowls of porridge slide, so just indulge me for a second. You know, there's one way to play this that is entirely about fiscal sustainability. So there's one way to structure the strategy for your spend that is, let's get in, let's get out, and let's get back to what we were doing previously. And that's scenario one. Potentially high level of sustainability in that we're investing in things that we can easily wind down at the end of the period. But ultimately, like, I think many of us are probably on this call because we actually want to change the way we've been serving students over the years. And we want to do something different and better to meet the needs of students. And so dissatisfying, so sustainable, yes, dissatisfying in terms of ultimately what we see as the potential impact of this investment. We're just reverting back to traditional strategies. Scenario two, second bowl of porridge, is the let's just drive it off the cliff, or let's drive toward the cliff scenario. So maybe the strategy might be to just invest in things that we want to be able to continue ongoing. We want to reduce class size. We want to provide cost of living adjustments in compensation for staff. Things that, sure, you can make an argument for why those things make sense, but they don't unwind easily. And so the way that you solve the sustainability in scenario two is by generating more revenue on the back end in time to fill the cliff before your car gets to that moment. Third scenario, obviously, you know, ERS, this is how we, how we think about things and how the members of our network improvement community have been thinking here. So how do you think about more of a do now, build towards strategy? So are there investments that you can make in the short term that are in excess of underlying spend, but that are giving you an opportunity to reconfigure how you're meeting the needs of students as you go, so that as you wind down the incremental spend, you're also then winding down historic legacy service delivery structures and actually moving yourself into new ways of working. That is the classic easier said than done, to be clear about that. We do think that our power strategies provide a little bit of a path and some ideas for how one might do that, and we actually would see in I think almost all of the members of our ESSER strategy network examples of folks trying to take this on, but very hard to do effectively, particularly with some of the labor challenges we've seen so far, particularly with some of the just the constraints on how we can use our money well. So sorry, and so now let me speak to sort of where you were earlier, and sort of the ESSER, the national media, the national narrative on use of funds. So we can just advance to, so we just pulled some headlines that we've seen that I think are representative of national media coverage. And I would say that there's two narratives that I think are ultimately counterproductive for where we are right now. So there's a narrative that I think conflates efficacy of spend with rate of spend. So the narrative has been that if we're not spending our money quickly, we must not be spending our money well. I'll say more about what we saw in our halftime reviews in a second, but ultimately, we want to leave no money on the table for sure, but we also want to spend the money well. And the path to doing so may not be entirely linear. The second narrative that I think that we worry about a little bit is, and we can say a little bit more. Sorry, the second narrative is the pressure to demonstrate changed student outcomes as the basis for judging whether we've spent the money well. So unless you can show me the regression that controls for everything you need to control for, that shows that reading and math went up as a result of these investments, then they weren't good choices. We can say more about this. We really think that taking much more of an improvement science, continuous improvement approach to thinking about the impact of our ESSER investments is a much more thoughtful and ultimately productive way of thinking about efficacy. And so it's something that I think you all as adjacent stakeholders to system leaders, I think can be helpful in helping shift this narrative. The other thing I would, so I just want to advance one more point to this point about rate of spend. That this is an issue, and that the less time we have to spend the money at the end, the more constrained our choices are going to be. So if you just animate one more time in, yes, we are thinking about a do now build toward. Can we just animate in that second? Yes, we're thinking about a do now build toward kind of strategy. The longer we wait to do the do nows, the faster the pivot is going to need to be to our new ways of working. So really important that in this school year and in the school year coming up, which is going to be the last full year of ESSER 3 availability, that we're thinking about really deliberately, what does that do now build toward transition look like? So I mentioned a bit about our halftime reviews. Let me just say a little bit about that to close. We've stepped back with about half of the members of our ESSER strategy network, so we can just advance one slide, to do an analysis of spend so far, and see what we can learn from that. So just animate in these next two pieces. You know, one thing that we've learned in doing this, in doing these halftime reviews, has been that when we set out plans initially, when our system leaders set up plans initially, they actually didn't have full view into student learning needs. We were just learning about how are our students coming back to us. We didn't have, we had theories about attendance and chronic absence, but we didn't have data yet. And so we built out strategy that was in some ways built on hypotheses about student need, but not grounded in student need. And so one of the really important parts of a halftime review is stepping back and just understanding what's the data look like on where our students are now, and how does that compare to what we thought originally when we put our plans together, and how therefore are we obligated to adapt our plans to better follow our sense of student need. Second thing I'd say is just doing the timing of this right now. If your systems haven't done a formal step back, you all are headed into SY 23-24 budget cycle. Many of you are probably kicking off budget planning meetings in November and December. We really need to think about integrating ESSER spending with ongoing general fund and operating spending. We can't keep these two things off cycle from each other. Really important to step back on ESSER spending now, so that as you're building in your revenue forecasts for FY 23-24 and your underlying budget development decision making, that you're doing so cognizant of what the opportunities you have, where you are on ESSER. So really important to be doing that work really right now. I'll end with just 4 quick learnings that have come out of our halftime reviews in these seven large higher poverty districts that were part of our network. One is the Mark Twain quote that reports of my death have been greatly exaggerated. The national media coverage, so national data on rate of spend actually lags the real rate of spend in districts, for a variety of reasons that are probably irrelevant to this conversation. One is that it's tracking reimbursement back to district, not the actual moment of spend. But what we're seeing in some of the nationally reported data is that the rate of spending appears to be slower than what districts actually are experiencing. It actually is in districts. But to be clear, it is across every district that we're working with, or almost every district that we're working with, slower than what the district originally intended. So yes, there is catch-up work to do. Second, a lot of our districts are pretty heterogeneous in terms of high and low need, high and low poverty, high and low need schools. We had a theory, and actually the instructional loss data would suggest that we need to be deliberate about differentiating more resources to schools and groups of students that are further behind. We are actually not seeing that differentiation in the districts where we're doing this review. So it's an important question to be asking ourselves right now going into the second half. Third thing is districts are in a place where they can make real continuous improvement plan, do, study, act kind of adaptations to their reviews. One of the challenges that we see that we've heard from districts is that school boards or that sort of stakeholders are sort of focused on the plan. The plan said you were going to do X. Where are you on that? And actually, we need some grace to be able to adapt. And actually, we need probably some incentives to be able to adapt what we're doing based on what we're learning is and isn't working, using this pretty classic Tony Bright continuous improvement plan, do, study, act kind of approach. And then the last thing is just a little bit of a cautionary tale, as I alluded to on the prior slide. The less time we have to adapt, the more constrained our choices are that are fully sustainable. And so the epilogue of our network, of our ESSER network, is really going to be about what really are the shrinking set of choices that we can make as systems to be able to land the kinds of investments we need to make in 23, 24, the last year of availability, in ways where we can pivot toward changing underlying ways of working, or just pull that spending back at the end of the period. So Olka, I'll pause there.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Jonathan, for that high-level view. So we're now going to turn it over to Dr. Andi Fourlis and to Holly Williams, both of whom work at Mesa Public Schools in Arizona, to kind of zoom in a little bit more on what's actually happening on the ground in districts and schools. So Andi and Holly, pass it on to you.
Thank you so much, and welcome everybody. I'm Andi Fourlis, super proud superintendent of Mesa Public Schools. We are the largest school system in the state of Arizona, serving just short of 60,000 students in 85 buildings. So, and coming from Arizona, many of you know that educational funding in Arizona is always at the bottom 5 of the country. And so you can imagine that when $250 million came into our system, we were ecstatic. We had high hopes for what was going to happen for our children and for our schools. And so we quickly went to work prioritizing where were we going to spend our monies, because we had a really hopeful mindset when we received these ESSER funds. We knew that we needed to deal with the emergency at hand, from personal protection equipment to retaining our staff. But we also knew that we had the opportunity to innovate and to redesign how we go about learning, the learning environments in which our children learn, and how we design the teaching profession. And it was, so a first step that we had was, as we think about these funds and how we were going to spend them, we needed to make sure that there was alignment to our strategic goals. So what you will see on this slide were our priorities, and that was a process that we went through within our leadership teams, asking what is most important. And so what you will see that came out of that was supporting students' health and not only their physical health, but also their mental health, making sure that we were committed to strong classroom instruction, implementing academic recovery strategies. And remember, we were designing this before we really knew what the gaps in learning were. Retaining and preparing that stable workforce, not just for today, but that workforce that we need not only today, but into the future. And then, as I spoke earlier, about innovating and redesigning the traditional experiences, because we know that what we do now, as Jonathan said, was going to prepare us for what the future will bring. And so those high priorities of recovering through COVID were directly aligned to our strategic goals that you see on the right-hand side, beginning with igniting a culture of learning and well-being, and then achieving college and career readiness, ensuring equity. So you will, and we did a whole lot about engaging our community as well. So there was a nice fit between our priorities and our strategic goals. So we see these funds as a way to accelerate and to provide some more opportunity for innovation to realize and accomplish the strategic goals for Mesa Public Schools. And all of this was done with our Associate Superintendent, Holly Williams, leading the charge of bringing collaborative groups together to continue to talk about what were the adult needs in our organization and what were the student needs in our organization. So I'm going to hand it off to Holly, who's going to share a couple more slides of some of the details that help to tell the Mesa Public School story.
Thank you, Dr. Fourlis. Good afternoon. I'm very happy to share with you on the next slide some of the way that we took the strategic plan and the priorities and used those as our lens for the things that we invested in. And so you'll see there with the idea of preparedness, response, prevention, and recovery that were always talked to us as these funds came out, we began to think about, okay, how do we make sure that our students and our teachers have exactly what they need when it comes to PPE and things like that? And you'll see a lot of that was preparedness in order to transition back into the in-person learning environment. But then from there, all of our money has been spent on taking those priorities that we set on that last slide and making them come to life. So you'll see things like improving district conditions. We continue to give retention stipends to our employees who've stayed with us. We've taken a look at how we've expanded our teacher pipeline and our substitute pipeline. I would love to tell you that we've got that solved, and I could give you the key to the how to have a fully staffed school, but we are continuing to work on that and putting very innovative plans in place to train our own, to grow our own, and to create a system by which we can fill our vacancies with people from within. I'll give you one example. We are offering to our instructional aides or parapros, as many of you know them, an opportunity to continue their learning and continue their degree program on the job, and offer those courses at a low or free rate so that they can get certified as teachers. So we have some really great opportunities with these funds to grow, to expand our workforce, and to make sure that our students have the best and highest quality teachers in front of them. For those student outcomes, things like our professional development plans and our tutoring, of course, but in addition to that, we've expanded dramatically our summer opportunities. And we've taken the opportunity to use this money to update equipment so that students have laptops that are functioning, and every student is one-to-one in our district now. So these ESSER funds have enabled us to make leaps and bounds from where we were prior to the pandemic when it comes to equipment and technology for students to have access to. And then in this last category of prevention and innovation probably is the bigger part of that for us, trying new things. And in the spirit of that, one of the things we did was we said, okay, we're going to set aside 10% of our ESSER $3 for us, which would have been about $15 million. And we're going to let the schools tell us what they need. So instead of it being a top down or a committee deciding what a school needs, we said to the schools, tell us what you need. Write it up, tell us what the return on investment will be, what will change because of this thing you're going to try. And we gave them the ability to try, and we called them innovation grants. So each school had the opportunity to apply for a grant and tell us what they wanted. We have everything from one of the great successful programs was one of our schools who struggled in literacy and reading scores. They invited their community to create home libraries, and they gave every family 50 books for a home library, and then taught the parents the importance of reading to their students every night. And they have the opportunity to refresh those books through the books that are at school, and kids can bring some back and trade them out. So there's a great synergy around literacy at that school, and seeing some progress in their literacy scores with the parents becoming partners in that work. Another thing that we're very excited about is we have the only elementary ag program in our state. We have an elementary school who has totally bought into the importance of agri-science and the impact it can have on student learning. And so with our ESSER dollars, we have supported that program through enhancing the areas for a barn so that we can have additional animals and an outdoor learning space for our students so that we can really make sure that students have a safe space to interact with the animals, but also the animals have a safe space to live on our campus. And we have blue ribbons, excuse me, that's what I want to say, from the state fair, from our youngest learners in agri-science going to the state fair and showing off their animals and their projects and earning great recognition already. On the next slide, as we have transitioned into this midpoint or the halftime review, as Jonathan shared, we are really paying attention to how are we collecting the stories. And Andy said it a little bit is, and so did Jonathan, about the expectation on schools is we're going to be able to show the impact on student achievement at the end of ESSER. We believe that that's comes in many different ways. So student achievement may look like a test score, but it also may look like attendance improvement. At that school that I talked to you about agri-science, we're seeing tremendous impact on attendance. Kids want to come to school because they're excited to work with the animals. So we don't think it's a one-shot metric to measure how successful the ESSER dollars have been in just a test score. We're collecting the stories, and through a metric review, through a systematic evaluation, everyone who's asked for funds or received funds or has an initiative going with ESSER has this. I've given you the athletics example, but they will be giving us the information about what they asked for, how it's been distributed, and the impact it's having. So we will evaluate. This will help us for a couple things. One, it will help us with evaluation. Is this something that we should continue past ESSER and find different dollars to continue to support it? It will also help us with the storytelling. There are great stories to be told. I just shared 2 with you about books and about agri-science, but there are many, many more happening in our district. And we hope that by gathering this feedback, we'll have those stories to share. And then again, back to that continuation. How are we going to, the things that are wildly successful, how are we going to continue to support in our community? Next slide talks a little bit about how we invested with our communities to even decide where to go. Dr. Fourlis shared with you the priorities. We didn't just sit around a table and say, this is what we want to do. We held many community sessions via WebEx as our platform, and we asked the community, what do you need? We held them in both English and Spanish so that everybody could participate. Parents jumped on and talked about what their hopes were for their students coming out of the pandemic. So when the pandemic was over, what did they want? And you'll see I show you some of the slides that we used in there because I wanted it to be clear to you that while we planned 1 and 2 because that was mostly about getting back in person and recovering, phase 3 has been about innovation, and we wanted our community's feedback specifically about how to spend that large pot of money. The next one. Next slide. The questions that we asked were these 2. How do you want your student to feel at the end of the year? And what do your students need right now? These were so insightful to engage our community in what do they want for their kids? And I'll tell you, not one, no, I shouldn't say not one. The loudest voice was not, I want every student to pass the state assessment at a high level. They wanted their students to be engaged. They wanted their students to love learning. They wanted their students to reconnect with adults. They wanted them to have an opportunity to try new things, to experience different kinds of programs, to have access to technology. Not many of them said, I want a higher test score. So our plan is centered on that, on making sure that students have, of course, the opportunity to have the best learning, but to think about learning in multiple ways and not just measured by one metric.
All right. Thank you, Holly. Thank you, Dr. Fourlis. And I'm now going to pass it over to Dr. Kent McGuire, who is at the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation. Kent?
Thank you so much. And I've really enjoyed kind of hearing these conversations. I'm reminded as I look through the participant list that, we probably have mostly education funders that we're really talking to. And so I've, since I am one, I appreciate the opportunity to think out loud with them. So I also want to thank GFE for what I thought was a really good meeting in Austin about a month ago, where we also had a chance to take up, these issues among others. What I appreciate about the session is that I know how important it is to my kind of colleagues in education philanthropy to deal with this question of recovery and helping kids rebound. And what wasn't immediately obvious to us even was what we could do when money might not be the most important tool in our box. I mean, you're sitting there, money is what we mostly do. We make grants. And here we were at a time when the people we're trying to help particularly when we're doing work directly with school districts, they've had more money than they've ever had. And so the very question of, we didn't even feel good trying to get their attention at a moment in which they were pretty busy trying to manage. Just imagine, I know Andi felt this, someone shows up with $250 million and there are lots of expectations that start to sort of pop up, in any community. Andi wouldn't be the only person that has an idea about what ought to happen with all those resources. And Andi and Holly got to figure out how to receive all that wonderful input and line it up with what they know they need to address. And so, Hewlett comes along and said, hey, you guys want to talk to us too? Well, we weren't so sure about, about that. So we really had to step back. What's a responsible way to be involved? We asked ourselves a few questions. Who's out there, since grants is what we make, who's out there that can actually help states and districts in this moment? We asked ourselves also, how do we leverage all of our existing investments? We probably have, 70 or $80 million actively spinning out there in the field. And we wanted to make sure that we did what we could do to help our existing grantees pay attention to and support the work of schools and districts and states. And then we asked ourselves, what could we learn now that might inform our own efforts to support innovation and improvement, not just now, but out into the future? So those were the kinds of questions that we posed as we thought about what to do. The answer to our first question was to identify and support a number of organizations who we felt had a few things that were really important in the moment. One, good relationships in the field on which they could draw and leverage. People who were, I guess if this were infrastructure work, you'd say shovel ready. But the point I'm trying to make is organizations who are already in relationship to the kinds of folks we wanted to help, so that they had trusting partnerships, they had insights and knowledge into the dynamics on the ground, and that if we could find those organizations, we could sort of put an exponent on the efforts to trying to recover. Two, that they had ideas about what would be helpful, in the moment. That they sort of came with at least strong hunches about the kinds of things that would be really useful. And three, that they had tools, resources, and supports and things like that, that they had an offer, things that they could hand off, they could leave behind. And so ERS was one of those organizations. And so we were happy to sort of give them the kind of help so that they could help Andi and Holly and others with what they were doing. But we gave a lot of support to the Council of Great City Schools, that being the network of districts that is particularly in touch with a very large percentage of the kids who we felt probably suffered the most as the pandemic hit. Digital Promise, Link Learning Alliance, I could go on, but we found a small group of organizations who had pre-existing networks and relationships, ideas about how to respond and help, and tools at the ready And those all felt to us like ways to sort of gin up supports and guidance quickly. So that's how we answered the first question. Then we thought one of the best ways to learn about what's really going on and how to help was to challenge ourselves to work deeply with a small number of districts around the country. And so we did that too. That we thought would give us a close look at the challenges, things you can't see from a distance. Give us an opportunity to test ways that our resources might actually help. Help us target needs that the federal funds can't address. We could buy people dinner and a glass of wine. There's these things, matter. And so we did a lot of things in the deep dives that we did in the different parts of the country. The first question we asked everyone was to put yourselves in your students' shoes and tell us what you see. And we really wanted our partners to say, wow, my goodness, the better I can appreciate and understand what kids are grappling with, the faster we can think about how to respond to that in ways that kind of meet the kids where they are. But we funded surveys to help generate data on how students were experiencing schools in the heat of the pandemic. We gave them a menu of choices from which to choose in terms of how to respond in the moment. We funded planning grants that would support retreats for leadership teams, boards, fund focus group work, so that folks could to invite others to come visit or to go make visits, just to do the kind of generative work that we thought would be helpful. And we've made money available to review the strategies that districts are using. And we hope ultimately to do a good job of evaluating the outcomes and impacts that accrue from the thoughtful use of the recovery dollars. I have to tell you, we did learn a lot about, and are continuing to learn a lot about the challenges that we're all facing. Many of these, or at least some of these, you might think of as pre-existing conditions. They were true before the pandemic, and they're even more true today. Declining enrollments in many districts, made even more challenging by a pandemic when you're trying to figure out how to, draw kids back. But there are very challenging politics. I don't know if there are in the Southwest, Andy, where enrollments might still be growing, but in the Northeast, east, in the middle of the country, lots of places, the reverse is true. And in urban districts particularly, those enrollment declines are putting upward pressure on per student costs. And it's not a walk in the park to decide which schools you could close. But the efficiencies that you could generate if you could close them actually help with some of the staffing challenges that we actually are struggling with today. Aging facilities, deferred maintenance, and things of that sort, causing district leaders and boards to have to think really hard about the investments they need to make when they can to make dramatic improvements in the quality of their facilities and in school climate, appreciating that there's a correlation between that and learning. The lack of attention to school finance equity in state aid systems. That means that many places never really fully recovered in terms of overall funding from the last recession or shock back in 2008 and 2009. So we can't lose sight of that. And now inflation, which is kind of putting a new set of pressures, whether it's for salaries or for the other kinds of resources that schools and districts need to run. So in some ways, these forces put a kind of limiting factor on the range of options available, particularly when you add Jonathan's point about the amount of time that's left to on ESSER funds. So let me just say this really quickly in terms of things my philanthropic colleagues might consider, in terms of being helpful. 3 things. 1, time to reflect and consider new ways of thinking. That time is in short supply. All the districts leaders we're working with greatly appreciate the opportunity to get together, but it's not like they're just sitting on their hands, with nothing to do. And finding the time and space to do that kind of generative thinking, I think, is highly valued. 2, support for monitoring, documenting, and even evaluating some of the investments that schools are actually making. And that contributes to the 3rd point, which is helping our partners in the field develop the kind of narrative that does an honest and thoughtful job of talking about the progress that we're trying to make. That's going to be absolutely key in what might come to be a bit of an environment in the near horizon where school leaders are being asked to explain or justify what they did with these resources. I thought the points made earlier about test scores are but one, and very possibly not even the 2nd or 3rd best way to characterize what people are up to, what kind of progress they're actually making, and what the progress they're making now gives rise to. So, okay, that's all I have to say. But I'm looking forward to the Q&A.
Thank you, Kent. I'm not sure that's all you have to say, and I hope you're all going to take part in this Q&A. Just for those of you who are participants, please make sure to drop your questions into the chat so we can include them. But I want to start, Kent, with the 3 things that you left for your fellow colleagues. And I want to start first with NAEP scores, because of course that is an overarching conversation. I'd be curious what you all think NAEP scores can and can't tell us, and how should we be interpreting them in a way that that makes sense? And I will start with Dr. Fourlis. How about you?
Oh, I'd be happy to. Thank you, Olga. I think as we look at NAEP scores, it really begs a lot of question. We have not seen an increase in NAEP scores for quite some time, and it makes me ask the question, is our current system working for our kids? And I really believe that the system is not working. So the scores tell me that we have to redesign what learning looks like, not only for our students, but also for our adults as they engage in the teaching profession and creating more sustainable, more long-term relevant learning opportunities for our children. I think COVID has told us that the typical place called school that is measured in the typical way is no longer relevant.
Anyone else? All right. Yeah, go ahead.
I think Andy is right. I suppose the technical answer is NAEP scores are the best way we can actually understand 2 things: long-term trends in academic performance that can be compare, not just over time, but across, jurisdiction, just because of the way they sampled. But the fact that we haven't really made a lot of progress, especially in the last decade and a half, on closing gaps, I think underscores Andi's point that we really need some new ways of thinking about, how to pull that off. All the pandemic has done is put those gaps in sharp relief.
So both of you are echoing something that one of our plenary panelists at the conference said. Dr. Pam Cantor was there, and she kind of said, this makes me really mad because actually NAEP scores tell us nothing. Like, we teach to the test. We didn't have a chance to teach to the test. The scores went down. So what did we expect? And so everyone's throwing up their hands. And all three of our panelists, and for those of you who haven't listened to the EdFunders podcast, Future of Smart, today's episode is actually that plenary conversation. But they talked about the need to really do what you were talking about, Andi, which is transform how education is done. Do you think we have a shared vision of where we want to be in 20 years if it's not a slightly better version of where we were when the pandemic started? And if we don't, do you think we can get there, or how should we get there?
I'll be happy to jump in on this, but I'm going to take some of Kent's words. And he says that one of their operating decision-making questions was, put yourself into the student's shoes. And what do you see? Let's ask our kids, and they will help us design the future that we need. We have done a lot of work absent of engaging our students and their families around what public education needs to look like and what we should be building towards.
Yeah,
So, and to answer your question, do we have a shared vision? I do not believe that the political narrative at the moment describes a shared narrative. But what I will tell you is every conversation I have with industry, they have a shared vision of the employees that they are looking for. It is now upon us in education to listen to what they're telling us and redesign what we're doing inside of the K-12 system to match the needs of industry, because we're getting caught up in a whole lot of narrative that is polarizing the K-12 system, absent of listening to industry.
So I'm wondering, though, whether we need a shared national vision or actually whether you need locally shared visions. And if there's a role for funders, Kent, in what you said about time and time to get together and time to have conversations, is there a role for funders in doing that? And Holly and Jonathan, given that you've worked very closely with sort of your community, Holly, and Jonathan working with districts that are trying to do the same, I'd be curious on your thoughts as well.
I was going to say I'm not known for short answers, but I want to try to give one. I think it's a absolutely perfect role for funders, to help create the time, use our convening authority, if you will, to sort of create the tables and places where people can actually come together to develop let's say, hopefully a more shared understanding of the role that public education plays in a modern democracy. I completely agree with Andi about, I think there's more consensus around the skills and competencies, let's say, that we want kids to have. Less agreement about other things. And I think if we can get from the math and science scores to questions of civic reasoning and discourse and helping kids learn and understand one another, we'll make the kind of, what we're looking at in the country today tells us how important it is for us to have a much broader view of what we need, schools to do with and for kids.
Now, Holly, you talked about how you were looking at the ROI on your ESSER dollars. And you talked about leading indicators, but that I want to open up this question to you and Jonathan in particular. How should we and how should funders be thinking about helping their district partners measure outcomes? It feels like one choice would be what you're doing, which is we're assessing all the way. You have process indicators and then end indicators. And I'm curious, besides Mesa, Jonathan, if you're seeing other places that are doing a particularly strong job in sort of measuring, evaluating, but in a more comprehensive way than we usually do.
Yeah, we've written a little bit about what Dallas is doing around this continuous improvement, and Dallas is part of our network. And Holly, I know you've had some interaction with those guys. This is, I don't know if it's straight improvement science, but it's close. One of the important things that we found is simply laying out the logic model that gets you from investment or input to outcome, whatever that outcome may be, whether that's reading and math test scores, whether that's attendance, whether that's something about wellness, enrollment, whatever it is. Simply just laying out that logic model is a critical and often missed step to be able to then have any further conversation about impact. What we see when we do that is that for us to get from an input to an outcome, we've got to be clear about what it is we're actually trying to do, and can then measure what our implementation and learn from our implementation and adjust as we go. The other thing that we can see is if we are doing this well, what are the first things we think we would see, whether that's a student being able to explain what the learning objective, roughly what the learning objective is of the lesson they're engaged in, whether that's whatever the individual little things may be. There's a bunch of things that that we know from research correlate with outcomes outside of our individual district's work. And so if we can't actually lay out the perfect regression that ties input to outcome, but we can demonstrate that we are doing the things in ways that we know are research-based, that are producing indicators that correlate with the outcome, then is that good enough? Can we actually declare victory from that? Because we're not going to ever have a regression that demonstrates the impact of a curriculum implementation that we did across our entire district. But we do know 6 or 7 characteristics of effective curriculum implementation. The other really interesting thing that comes out of actually some of the conversations that Holly, and the folks in Mesa we were having last week when I actually got to meet you in person. It was amazing after 2 years. And also in Dallas is actually maybe Kent, this is your point about riding along, is by engaging folks, teams are now engaged in these continuous improvement kinds of exercises. That's actually building a little bit of muscle and capacity to be able to do this throughout the district, whether it's an ESSER initiative or just a new way of working. I do think that that's an important, probably unmeasured outcome that we're seeing in some of the districts that are really embracing this.
To add to what Jonathan's saying is through that lens, one of the things that we're going to use as a measure is, does it further our strategic goals? Are we able to see that the impact, while maybe test scores, yes, attendance, yes, behavior, yes, but can we say that the goals that we have set for ourselves prior to the pandemic are better than they were when we started? We will say that as a success also, and that's a measure that we're using, that those goals are progressing and being met.
So I had one question I was dying to ask you, but I'm aware it's the top of the hour and I really want to respect your time and the time of those who joined us. So thank you all so much. The question I will leave you with, and would love any answers you'd send to me, is what infrastructure investments could we make at this moment? What would those be? Would they be around assessment? Would they be around different definitions of outcomes? All those things are important. So thank you all for your perspectives, your insights. For those of you who've joined us, thank you so much. The video of this will be available in about a week because there was a lot of great content in here, and sign up for updates. And then we have some great upcoming programs that are going to go across U.S. workforce issues, the family and school partnerships, a specific subset of students, and then the future of education and investing in policies that transform learning. Thanks so much and have a great rest of your day.